draw your attention, please, to the exits from the theatre. One down here to your left, two at the back, one in each corner, including the one you came in by. And please, if you have to leave this theatre, would you A, do so in an orderly fashion, and please settle on the car park outside. May I also ask that you turn your mobile phones off or put them on silent. In exactly 2 weeks' time, on Thursday the 17th of April, that's 1 week later than originally advertised, we have our AGM, followed by Abigail Hutty from Astrid at Stevenage, who will speak on ExoMars rover, engineering for the Red Planet. You may have read in the paper, the Secretary of State, Bruce Cable was down there, I think, Thursday of last week. As far as your branch committee is concerned, we have a vacancy for branch secretary because of a resignation earlier this year. And I'm sure you will be delighted to know that we have a volunteer from within the present committee. However, as always, if anyone would like to put themselves forward, will they do so please in the next 7 days? Similarly, any items for any other business. As usual, we will give you a foretaste of our lecture season starting in September, including Dr. Hugh Hunt, who will talk about Zeppelins, and perhaps a surprise autumn visit to London. Branch visit on the 15th to RAF Northolt and Ratcliffe Bunker is fully subscribed, and a reserve list is in operation. Confirmation slips were posted out this week. And so to tonight's lecture. A vote of thanks this evening will be given by David Whitehead, Branch Vice Chairman, and for the moment at least, Acting Branch Secretary. It has been a real privilege as your Branch Chairman to introduce some special people to talk to us. You will recall, for example, Wing Commander Andy Green, holder of the World Land Speed Record, and Captain Richard Crestigny, who nursed a crippled Airbus A380 back to safety after suffering a catastrophic engine failure in flight. Well, tonight we have somebody really special. Our speaker was born near Edinburgh in 1919. Just need to work out what that is. He first flew at the age of around 8 or 9 in a Gloucester Gauntlet flown by his father, sitting on his knees. So began an extraordinary life, not a career, a life in aviation. And there was simply not enough time to tell you anything but a few highlights. He read modern languages at Edinburgh University, specialising in German, which was to prove highly significant. At the outbreak of war, he joined the RNVR as a fleet-around pilot, serving initially in the escort carrier Audacity, during which time he shot down 2 Luftwaffe maritime patrol aircraft. His deck landing experience was put to good use at his next posting to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, where he was responsible for checking the deck landing capability of all aircraft carriers before they actually got into service. In doing so, he achieved around 1,500 deck landings on no fewer than 22 carriers by the end of 1943. He then went operational flying again, this time with the Royal Canadian Air Force, escorting B-17s on bombing missions over France, during which time his family home was destroyed by a B-1 flying bomb. Fortunately, no one was hurt. He next found himself in Italy, testing captured Italian and German aircraft. So it was not surprising that as the war was coming to an end, he found himself involved in trying to retrieve Luftwaffe aircraft before they fell into Soviet hands. On one such mission to get hold of some Arado 234s, he flew into an airfield in Denmark, which he was told had just fallen to the Allies. When he landed, he discovered that it hadn't. But fortunately for him, the Luftwaffe commander offered him his surrender, and all those 2,000 men under his command, which Eric very gratefully accepted. The Allies arrived the following day. On a more sombre note, During this time, he was asked to assist in the interrogation of both Goering and Himmler, and also the commandant of Belsen concentration camp. But it is about the next episode in this extraordinary life he's come to speak to us tonight, flying captured enemy aircraft. He has flown, as captain in command, 487 different types of aircraft. That's types, not marks. And that is an official Guinness Book record, and is unlikely, I'm sure you'll agree, ever to be beaten. He holds the world record for the number of aircraft carrier deck landings, 2,407, and landed the first twin-engine aircraft on a carrier, and also the first jet aircraft. He is also the survivor of no fewer than 11 crashes. Ladies and gentlemen, the warmest of welcome, please, for the Fleet Air Arm's most decorated pilot, Captain Eric Brown.
Before we start, can you hear at the back all right? Yeah. Okay? Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great privilege for me to come here to this magnificent seat of learning, Cambridge University. I know a lot more about it than I do about the boat race, let me assure you. But the aviation department here has always been in the forefront of anything innovative. Now tonight I'm going to talk to you about a most fascinating period in history, beginning in 1944. Now in that year, I was the chief naval test pilot at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. In about the middle of the year, I had been appointed as the commanding officer of the captured enemy aircraft flight. Now, what did that mean? Well, quite a lot of aircraft had been, German aircraft of course, had been shot down over the United Kingdom. And they had been repairable, and we did that very thing and flew them because we wanted to find out what their operational capabilities were and inform our pilots of what they were up against, what the weaknesses were, what the hotspots were on these aircraft, so that they would know how to deal with them in combat. Now, about the middle of the summer, Winston Churchill, our Prime Minister, was very concerned about what was happening in Germany. We were making advances, of course. D-Day had occurred and we were invading. But suddenly, things took a turn. We were bombarded to begin with, round about June or July, with a total of almost 10,000 V-1 flying bombs. And they caused a considerable amount of damage and disaster. Then, following very quickly on that, came some 1,500 supersonic guided missiles, the V-2. And the V-2, because it was supersonic, was quite terrifying for the civilian population, because the first you knew of it was the bang when the bomb exploded. And then you had to wait for the rumble of the supersonic boom. As if this wasn't enough, we discovered that our photographic reconnaissance Spitfires had flown over the German research establishment at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. And they had come back with photos of scars on what was a grass airfield. These puzzled us at first, but there was a very bright lady called Constance Babington Smith at Medmenham, the place where photographic interpretation took place. She had remarkable eyesight and concluded that these were the photos, were the tracks of either rocket aircraft or jet aircraft, or possibly both. In this, she was 100% correct. Anyway, Churchill realized something had to be done. So, he felt it was too late to interfere before the war was concluded. But what he must do was find out how the Germans had acquired this advanced technology to threaten us in this way. So, he said to the director of the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Mr. W.S. Farron, said, I want to form a mission which I am going to call the Farron Mission, and your job is to go into Germany as soon as you can, when the war is beginning to abate a bit, and find out what their technology is and how they've arrived at it. So he gave us 3 priorities. First was find the German supersonic wind tunnels and, if possible, bring them back to the UK. Why were we interested in supersonic wind tunnels? Because the German aircraft were beginning to exceed ours considerably in performance. And to achieve that, they were devising shapes of their aircraft and wings by putting them in these shapes in the supersonic wind tunnels. They had 7 supersonic wind tunnels we knew of. The Italians had 1. The Allies, America, Britain, France, Russia, had not a single supersonic wind tunnel amongst them. So, we were very far behind in this area. Second priority, find their advanced aircraft, and if they haven't been vandalized, bring them back to the UK so that we can flight test them. Particularly their jets and their rocket aircraft. Thirdly, find their chief aircraft designers, test pilots, and interrogate. So, I was appointed as the chief interpreter and the chief pilot to this mission. I was fluent in German because I had been a school teacher in Germany pre-war. And we were on standby from the 1st of January 1945. The first alert we had came from the intelligence section of the British Second Army, who said that they had just overrun an airfield just south of Hanover called Fassberg. And on this airfield, they had found 2 aircraft. The Army wasn't sure what they were, being Army. But they thought they were jets. And they had been flown in by two pilots, German pilots, who had dumped them and fled, and merely had given an indication that they wanted to get into the British zone of occupation as far away from the Russians as they could. So, on the 14th of April, I flew over to Fassberg, and there, lo and behold, were two totally intact twin-jet aircraft of the type we most wanted, the Messerschmitt 262. So these wonderful prizes, there weren't German ground crew around, they didn't know anything about the jets, but I instructed them to keep an eye on them, and of course our army was going to keep an eye on them. Anyway, while I was talking to the ground crew, the brigadier who was in charge of the unit that had overrun Fassberg was called Brigadier Glyn Hughes, good Welshman, and he said to me, "I've listened to you talking to the air crew, to the ground crew, sorry." He said, "and you talk or you speak better German than my interpreter. Would you come on a 2-day operation with us tomorrow?" I said, "I can't give you 2 days, but I can give you 1. What is the operation?" He said, "Well, we are going to liberate the concentration camp at Belsen." And he then said, "There are our vehicles all ready to go tomorrow morning." Now, I was a bit shocked at this because the vehicles were no more than the equivalent of Land Rovers. I thought we'd go in armoured cars. There'd be a fight. But he said, the situation has totally changed. The Germans themselves had found in Belsen 20,000 cases of typhus. And they realized if the inmates, guards, any people in Belsen got running free because the more they were allowed this, we could start another Black Plague sort of thing in Germany. They therefore had a white flag truce meeting with our British Second Army, and it was agreed of what would be done would the German and the Hungarian armies would ring in the whole of Belsen to prevent anybody leaving. And we would come with a medical unit, take over, and they would go back to fight the British elsewhere. Strange situation, but a very, very critical one. Anyway, we arrived at Belsen, and I wouldn't say they greeted us, but we acknowledged each other, and they handed over totally to our people. When I went in, first thing I noticed was within a short time of entering, I saw a pile of bodies, 2/3 of whom were women, piled up in a mound, which would be about halfway up to this street. And they weren't laid out reverently as dead bodies. They had all been bulldozed into position. So they were all lying in grotesque positions, and nearby were a couple of barrack buildings, about 30 feet long, maybe 16 feet wide. These had originally been built to accommodate 60 people. When we got there, in each barrack were 250 people, with one loo at the end of the barrack. On each side there were 3 tiers of bunk beds, open slats. Everybody in the barrack was dying. None of them would ever get up again. But they were lying there, people in the top bunk messing on the people below them, and the people on the bunk below messing on the one below them. The thing that I remember most about Belston is not the sight of these dead bodies, but the stench of that barrack room. Absolutely unbelievable. To this day I can still smell it. In each of these bunks there should have been one person. We found as many as 7 in one of these bunk beds, on one level just. We were all, of course, wearing surgical masks, and there were a few of the inmates walking around in their striped pajamas sort of suits, and I spoke to 1 or 2 of them. They were all Germans, and you realized they were zombies. You would talk to them, well, they would stand there and look, just stare at the ground as you talked to them. You realized you weren't getting through to them at all. And as after you stopped, they would just step aside and walk away. But really, you hadn't connected with them in any way at all. Anyway, I said to the brigadier, what do you want me to do? And he said, I want you to interrogate the camp commandant and the female camp commandant. The camp commandant was one Joseph Kramer. And I interrogated him as to what had driven him to do this and why had he continued with it. He was pretty straightforward. He realized the game was up and he would almost certainly be executed. So he told everything that he felt we wanted to know. Then came the lady, if I can call her that. She was the worst human being I have ever met, called Irma Grazer. About 24 years old, farmer's daughter. Cruelty was her trade. Nothing was too cruel for her. She had been the female camp commandant at Auschwitz and had fled there 2 months before I interrogated her because the Russians were about to overrun Auschwitz. In the interrogation room we used, which was Joseph Kramer's main room, we had a table, the brigadier sat on one side, and we had a chair here where we put Irma Grazer, and I said, what do you want me to ask her? He said, ask her if she had her time over again, would she do all this, as she's done? I asked her this, she refused to answer. I said, what do you want me to do now? He said, keep asking until she answers. So I kept asking her. After about 4 times, she leapt to her feet, gave the Heil Hitler salute, called out, of course, Heil Hitler, Sieg Heil, and sat down. We couldn't get another word out of her. Didn't matter, we were going to execute her. And at the end of the day, there were about 230 guards there. We executed a lot. We gave them sort of things called courts martial, where they would have about quarter of an hour, 20 minutes to defend themselves. But all this was in sight of these mounds of bodies. How can you defend yourself in these circumstances? Anyway, we executed the lot. 234, I think it was. And in order to do this, Second Army brought over the official British hangman, Albert Pierpoint. And believe you me, he was a weirdo. I have never met a guy in my life with so much job satisfaction. But he, for some reason unknown to me, he restricted himself to 9 executions a day. I didn't see mine yesterday's at all. But I said to him, look, when you come to Elma Gresa, make sure you tie her hands behind her back so she doesn't give you the Hitler salute. He said, don't worry, sir, I tie all the hands behind the backs. He was a craftsman. Well, that was Belston, and we had to move on. And the next thing we got was, I went back to Farnborough, and this was April, as I told you, 15th of April when we went into Belston, and nothing happened again until the 4th of May. And then, again, Second Army alerted us that they had found a wing of Messerschmitt 163 rocket fighters in an airfield called Husum on the west coast of Schleswig-Holstein. There you have the ME-163. Now, this was a fascinating aircraft. Let me show you some of the innovative features of it. Firstly, wings swept 22 degrees. Swept wings at this stage in aviation history were almost unknown in Britain. In fact, the rest of the world. In spite of the fact there had been a major conference on them in 1935, given by the Germans in Italy, attended by Britain, Italy, America, Russia. Nobody had taken it up except the Germans. But this was a feature that was to really make us sit back and think. So that you have that. The next thing is you have no horizontal tail. You have a vertical tail there, but no horizontal tail. You just have here things called elevons, which are combined ailerons and elevators. Then you have underneath here a rocket motor, capable of giving about 7,000 pounds of thrust. Now this was a liquid fuel rocket motor, and although the liquid fuel had been tried in rockets before, there was a difference. Because if you have a rocket and you light the paper is sticking out of one end, nothing you can do to control it until it burns completely through. However, one bright boy called Dr. Walter had managed to make this partially controllable by a throttle. It had 3 positions. You could have idle, cruise, or full power. Now that is not full flexibility, but it is a measure of flexibility which makes it a reasonable fighting machine. The other interesting feature, you landed, of course, on a skid. These wheels have nothing to do with landing at all. They are merely a trolley for takeoff. But it was critical to jettison this trolley at the right height. Because if you jettison a bit too low, it would bounce up and hoop onto the front of the seat. This did happen and usually ended in a fatality. The huge amount of drag it had. You couldn't be towed off, or the rockets would push you off with it, but when it came to landing, dead stick, you were in huge trouble. The other problem was if you dropped it too high, it would bounce up, penetrate the underside of the fuselage here, where there was one of the two volatile fuels that fed this rocket. That fuel was concentrated hydrogen peroxide, one of the most explosive fuels you couldn't have. And if the wheel struck the tank there, there'd be a huge explosion and aircraft and pilot would be blown to smithereens. So it was a very dangerous aircraft. Quite apart from that, just the volatility of this fuel was terrible, because before I flew it, and this made me think a lot, I found out that the Germans had 42 fatal accidents landing this aircraft. Every landing, of course, was a dead stick landing. You were supposed to have no fuel aboard at all. Let the whole thing burn off. But that was almost impossible. You would almost always find some residual fuel left. Half a wine glass full of fuel left in the tanks was enough to explode with the impact of landing on the skid. And the aircraft and pilot would be blown to smithereens. 42 such accidents. I tell you, when I flew this aircraft under power, I exercised that jettison system like it had never been exercised. There we go. It was a thunderous airplane to fly, huge noise. The pilot really was in a tin coffin, because cockpit there, this is a 600-mile-an-hour airplane. The maximum speed you were allowed to open the hood, cockpit canopy, to get out if you wanted was 250 miles an hour. Otherwise, it was immovable. So you were in there until you either reduced the speed or took the consequences. Highly dangerous airplane. Was it worthwhile? I don't think so. In its whole operational history, it had 16 combat successes. It had up here 2 30mm cannons, so it had quite a bunch. But as I say, 16 combat successes, 10 combat losses. That is not much of an operational record. So I call this a tool of desperation. Right, from then on, I'll show you, I decided when you look at this airplane, it's not the sort of airplane you say to a pilot, show me the throttle, show me the fuel box, and I'll be off. It's nothing like that at all. And I therefore took, before I flew it under power, found out how the Germans treated it. The first thing that they did was fly this glider called the Stubel Habich. Now this means the Habich was the German word for hawk. And it was a normal glider, but Stubel means they clipped the wings off the end of the glider, reduced the span, therefore make the landing speed higher. Landing speed was of the order of 90 to 100 miles an hour. Nothing startling, but it was a glider. Then, next thing, we flew a training version of the 163. 163 operational aircraft was called the 163B. This was called the 163A. It had a lesser landing speed and easier to fly, really. Now you were turned up to 20,000 feet by a Messerschmitt 110 and released there, and you were able to practice gliding back to base. I did 5 flights in the Stummel Havoc and 3 flights in this, just to make sure I was in sufficient practice to fly proper operational flight. Now, the other one, let's look at the rocket itself. There is the rocket. As you can see, it's a very tiny piece of apparatus. And I wanted to know more about this. So I went to Kiel, where Dr. Walter had his rocket factory. The day I arrived at Kiel was the 7th of May, 1945. Now, the 8th of May, the next day, was the capitulation of Germany. So when I arrived at Kiel, theoretically, well, not theoretically, in fact, we were still fighting in Germany. Went into this factory, found Dr. Walter with no problem, and said to him, I'd like a demonstration of the power and effect of the ignition or combustion of these rocket fuels. He refused. So I was armed to the teeth with 9mm revolvers. And remember, we were still at war. Next day was the capitulation. So I held this at Dr. Walter's head and said, a demonstration or else. And you have no idea how speedily he is. Anyway, we were fitted out in non-organic suits, and he brought an assistant out, and this assistant held out 2 glass rods. And on one, he dropped just a drop of concentrated hydrogen peroxide. And on the other, the catalyst called hydrogen hydrate, 1 drop of that. Let these drops fall to the floor and meet, and the subsequent explosion blew the glass rods clean out of his hand. I was standing about 3 feet behind him, and it made me stagger back about 2 feet. So that was with 1 drop in each one of these glass rods. Anyway, we'll move back to, could you show them the other one? There, I captured 24 usable 163s. There you see 14 of them lined up, ready to be transported back to Britain. I flew the 163 on tow a lot in Britain, but nobody else flew the aircraft, and even the Americans didn't have a go at it. And we gave, eventually, when we finished the work, gave these away to Commonwealth countries as gate sentinels at airfields. And much appreciated, all of them. And the one I actually flew is up at the airfield near Edinburgh, not the airfield, the museum near Edinburgh, Strathallan Museum. So if you want to see the actual one, that's what it is. time now to go back to Strasbourg and look at the 262. This, in my opinion, was the most formidable aircraft of World War II. Let me show you some of its features. Fuselage looks like a shark, all the result of experiments in their supersonic wind tunnels. Swept wings again, in this case a little more swept than the 163, 26 degrees. But above all, jet engine. Now, as most of you know, Frank Whittle, with whom I worked a very long time, was the developer of the original jet engine. And he developed the engine on the centrifugal principle. Now, what I mean with that is a jet engine has three basic areas: the compressor, combustion chambers, and the turbine. Compressed air, ignited, and it blows through the turbine, rotates the turbine, which is geared to the compressor, and the cycle is therefore continuous. Now, the Germans were aware of Frank Whittle's experiments, and they took it a bit further and developed the axial flow engine. Now today, all jet engines are axial flow. So the Germans went the right way. And later in life, I said to Frank, you knew all about the axial flow engine. Why did you go centrifugal? He said, because at that stage in jet development, I wanted to give the RAF a simple engine and a reliable one. Now, how wise he was at that stage, because Frank Whittle's engine had a time between overhauls of 100 hours. The German jet axial flow engines had a scrap life of 25 hours. And in fact, that figure is dubious, because at the end of the war, I spoke to Adolf Galland, who had a squadron, or a wing almost, of Me-262s in Bavaria. And he said they were averaging 12.5 hours before they had a failure. So it was a very dicey stage of development. The engines were so sensitive that if you moved the throttle at any speed at all, either forward or backward, you flamed out the engine. And so this sensitivity was such that eventually the Germans operated the airplane by taking off, going to climb throttle, climb power, and never touching the throttle for the rest of the source. So it was a climb power all the time. No wonder it didn't last long. But that was one aspect. The other main thing about this was, here you had 4 30mm cannon, huge. Now this was an airplane, you didn't dogfight with an airplane like this. All you did was dart in on a slashing run against the enemy, blast them to bits with your 4 30mm guns and get out of it. Then they couldn't really get near you at all. To show you the discrepancy between performance At this time, 1945, end of the war, the top British fighter was the Spitfire Mark 14, with a top speed of 446 miles an hour. 446. This aircraft, when I brought it back to Farnborough, tested it at a top speed of 568. 125 miles an hour faster than the fastest Allied fighter. We won in the same league. It was quantity against quality. We had loads of airplanes because of the industrial power of the United States and Britain, and the Germans, of course, had the quality but couldn't take advantage of it, mainly because they were running short of pilots and short of fuel. Now, to finish this first half of the thing, let me tell you how this would operate. It really was meant to deal mainly with the American B-17 Flying Fortress bombers. What you would do was come down in a stern attack, and the 30mm cannon had an effective range of 650 yards. So you would open fire normally at about 600 yards. But your closing speed was so high that you were in danger of colliding with a target unless you pulled away at about 200 yards. So your total firing time in the attack was 2 seconds. Now in 2 seconds, you can use your aircraft to point at the enemy aircraft and fire, but you have not time to sight and fire. You are firing at random. They had made the mistake of not fitting dive brakes. If they had fitted dive brakes, they could have extended the firing time to 4 seconds. And that gives you enough time to sight and fire. So it was a fundamental mistake. But in spite of that, this aircraft devastated the B-17's daylight operations, of course. Right, we'll have another look at some of the other aircraft. Here's the other jet, the Arado 234B. As you can see, it's a beautiful aircraft. Beautiful aircraft, very fast, top speed of 467 miles an hour, faster than any of our fighters. Now, whereas the 262 and the 163 only operated over Germany, this aircraft operated over Britain. And we have many photos of it, and the targets it photographed. It was mainly photo reconnaissance, but it took major strategic targets, such as the ICI works at Middlesbrough, photographed. And it could fly back with impunity, because it had no defense, didn't have any guns at all, because it depended totally on evasive speed. But a very fine airplane to fly. The same engines exactly as on the ME-262. And a lot of unusual, a lot of helicopter type of glass cockpit. And as you see, it's beautifully streamlined. And on landing, it was very difficult to stop. So it was fitted with a, you don't see it now, but the pilot on touchdown could release a drone parachute, which reduced your landing distance by about 25%. But a very thrilling airplane to fly. There's the final jet. Very interesting one too. The Heinkel 162. This, again, was a tool of desperation. It was built too late at the end of the war to even get involved in operations. But it had some remarkable features. Whereas the other axial flow jets all were built by Junkers, this was built by BMW. Axial flow, BMW. And the aircraft speed was much the same as that of the 262. Of all these aircraft we've talked about, the only one fitted with an injection seat was this 162. And the Germans had a different principle of injection to Martin Baker. Martin Baker used cordite, and the Germans used compressed air. And they had another twist before Martin Baker thought of it. And that was, they argued, the Germans argued that if you were going to eject, you were probably out of control. Therefore, almost certainly under heavy G, and could not get your arms up. I was once in a situation like this under 4G, wanted to eject, but my arms were weighing 4 times their normal, and no hope of getting at the blind at all. So the Germans had thought of this, and they had down by the left side of the pilot a switch, a trigger, which if you pulled it, fired the ejection seat, even though your arms were pressed down like this with a G, out you would go without your face blind, so you would take a bit of a beating on your face, but at least you got out. And so this was quite an interesting aircraft in every way. Now this is the dreaded Stuka, which is could only really operate in an environment of air superiority. You had to have fighter control over the space because this was an easy target if it was flying on its own for a fighter. But I've flown most of the dive bombers in the world, and you hear tales of, oh yes, this one, you have a wonderful vertical dive. Not one of them I've flown could dive beyond 60 degrees, really, except this one. And this one dived beyond 60 degrees because the pilot didn't do it, it did it itself. Now with that, I mean, not out of control, on the contrary. What you did was, with this airplane, come over the target, see your target, wing over onto it, and when you winged over, pop the dive brakes. Before you winged over, you set the height at which you wanted to release your bomb. Then you winged over. When you popped the dive brakes, automatic control took over from the pilot. You had no control thereafter on the movement of the stick. Went into what really was a screaming 90-degree dive. And when you're in a dive like that, believe you me, you have the feeling you are going over yourself head first. But it is the world of difference between a 90-degree dive and a 60-degree dive. When the light comes on, which you set for the bomb release, you then press a little button on the top of the control column. That then drops the bomb and you come out under 6G. And the curtains come down, of course, at 6G, you black out. But when you come to, happily you'll be up about 6,000 feet. And you're able to get control of the situation. Very effective indeed. Very effective. There are the controls that help to do this automatic system. Now, we've talked about fighters, piston engine fighters. We've talked a lot about jet fighters, but piston engine fighters were, of course, in the ascendancy for most of the war. We had the wonderful Spitfire, and the Americans had the equally wonderful Mustang. And the Germans had, you hear a lot about the 109, I thought it was a terrible airplane. The greater fighter the Germans produced was the Focke-Wulf 190. Wonderful because wonderful design, and this was the ultimate model they made, the D9. It was a piston engine airplane, a radial engine rather, and that may look like an inline engine, but in fact it is a radial engine and with a wonderful curling streamlining design. Why was it so good? Because the designer, Kurt Tank, which was the best designer Germany had, not Willy Messerschmitt, Kurt Tank miles better, because he was their chief designer and their assistant chief test pilot. So he knew both ends of the game. In fact, they had trouble with him keeping him out of trouble, because he insisted, whenever enemy aircraft came over, on going up at a 190, hoping to have a go at it. And fortunately, this didn't happen. But he was an outstanding designer. I interrogated him at the end of the war, and that is really a misnomer. He interrogated me because he wanted to know my opinion of every Focke-Wulf aircraft I had flown. And he was a pilot, remember, as well as a designer. And he knew what he was talking about. He really did. Willy Messerschmitt, I had a lot of arguments with, because he was a bit unscrupulous about the strength, integrity of his aircraft. When I challenged him on this, he got very angry, and he said it was all the fault of Adolf Galland, who insisted that the ME-109 must have a better rate of climb than it did. Of course, the only way you can achieve that is reduce the structural weight. You reduce the structural weight, you reduce, of course, the integrity of the structure. And wings started coming off 109s towards the end of the war because of this. So he was, as I say, a bit suspect. The most interesting designer I ever met was not an aircraft designer, but the designer of the V2, Wernher von Braun. And Wernher von Braun was a genius in every sense of the word. He wasn't captured, he gave himself up. to the Americans. This man, I've never met anybody with more self-confidence than Wernher von Braun. And when he gave himself up to the Americans, he could barely speak English. But he said to them, they didn't capture him, he gave himself up. He said to them, aren't you the lucky ones to capture me? Because I am going to take you to the moon. This he said in 1945. And as you well know, he achieved it. My best friend outside the United Kingdom was Neil Armstrong, first man in the moon. And Neil had the highest regards for Wernher von Braun. He said not only was he a genius in this area of rocketry, almost anything he touched. For example, when he gave himself up, he could barely speak English. Within 2 months, he was fluent in English. He asked to be taught to fly in America. It took him 2 hours before he went solo. This is the sort of guy he was. He was a genius in every sense of the word. Of course, he could have been arraigned as a war criminal, because to build his rockets he used slave labor. But that really didn't happen, because the Americans saw what he had to offer them and decided they'd take him along that route. Right, now look at some of the other. Now there is the Dornier 335. Very unusual airplane indeed. Tandem engines. Front you've got a normal tractor engine, at the back a pusher. And with a night fighter, the wings, although they don't look at it, were swept actually 18 degrees. Very fast. The fastest piston engine fighter ever built. Twin engine fighter ever built. And it only arrived at the end of the war. Here are interesting features. As you see, it's very clean. It was very difficult to stop landing. So the Americans, although the Germans, had fitted a reverse pitch prop on the front. And when you touched down, you went into the reverse pitch, just as airliners do on their jets nowadays, and reduced the landing distance by at least 25%. The getting out of this airplane was a potential problem. So here is what the drill was. You firstly had 3 levers or 3 buttons on the right-hand side of the cockpit. Press number 1, there was a loud explosion, and off went this. Disappeared. Press number 2, another loud explosion, and the mincing machine went. Press number 4 was just to arm the seat, and then you had to manually jettison the cockpit before you fired the blind. Now we found an interesting thing when we captured the test pilots involved. They were rather frightened of this airplane because it had 2 accidents, and both the pilots had been found with no arms. And we were a bit puzzled about this, so we treated it with a bit of caution until I asked them to put the canopy arrangement into the wind tunnel. Now the canopy had 2 levers. You're sitting facing forward. Pilot had 2 levers ahead of him, at this angle forward, about 45 degrees. To jettison the hood, you had to grip these two levers, pull them back through 90 degrees. But we found in the wind tunnel, they went about 10 degrees before you'd gone to the full thing. Now here you were, tugging at something, full, powerful grip on, suddenly it goes. Arms limited. And the Germans themselves hadn't solved this problem. And when it went into, well, it only went into very, very limited service at the end of the war. But full of innovation, as you can see. Another interesting thing for you young students of aerodynamics, for some reason, this thing flew 10 miles an hour faster on the rear engine with the front engine feathered than it did on the front, with the front engine working and the rear engine feathered. Why? We haven't worked it out to this day. So that's your next exercise. Right, see, go on again. And this is an interesting airplane, it looks rather ordinary. Night fighter called the Heinkel 219. And it was supposed to be the German answer to the Mosquito. Night fighter. Some very interesting innovations. The main one being the injection seat system. You had a pilot here facing forward, a radar operator here facing aft. If they were in trouble and wanted to eject, either of them could initiate the ejection. Hopefully he told his chum he was doing it. But anyway, you press the button, irrespective of who initiates it or presses the button, they go in this order. The radar operator goes out first, that way. 3/10 of a second later, the pilot goes out that way. And hopefully never returns on. But in its entire operational life, they had 12 attempted ejections. That's involving, of course, 24 people. All 12 were totally successful. All 24 were saved without any problem. So their German ejection system was really first class. The other thing about this airplane was, to this day, it haunts Bomber Command because it had, here we've taken them away, but there were two 30mm cannon based here and pointing 65 degrees upwards and forward. Now, in the Battle of Britain days, night fighting, and it was the same throughout the entire war for Britain, night fighters, must be difficult for you youngsters to imagine what the skies were like over this country at night. There were literally hundreds of airplanes flying around. And you had to find out whether it was an enemy one you were going to attack or one of your own. So the first thing to do as a night fighter was pick your prospective target, get under it, look up to have it silhouetted against the sky, make up your mind whether it was British, whether it was enemy or our own. If you thought it was enemy, you then had to slide back, get up through the slipstream of the aircraft and fire this. By the time you did all this, he'd probably twigged you were there and gone off into cloud. With this device called Schräge-Musik, which means inclined organ pipes, really. These guns were like big organ pipes. You just fire under your target, identify it, and if it is enemy, press the button and blast them out of the sky. On its very first sortie, test sortie, this aircraft on one sortie shot down 6 Lancasters. And throughout the entire war, it took a tremendous toll on Bomber Command. They never solved what to do with it. It was not only fitted to this aircraft, this was the first. It was fitted to the Messerschmitt 110 and to the Ju-88. Caused absolute mayhem against the night bombers. They weren't interested in the day bombers. They were left to the fighters, the day fighters who would wanted, of course, daylight to kill them. So it was a deadly night weapon, very deadly. This is the biggest aircraft I flew, the Blumenvoss 222. And 6 engines. Interestingly, there were diesel engines, and they had a wonderful specific fuel consumption because this boat had a huge range. Could stay up for about certainly more than a day. And it really was very impressive. But above all, what we were interested in was the control system. It did not have ordinary controls, that is to say, fitted. The pilot, when he pulls the stick, his wire is connected directly to the control, and he operates the control. In this case, not. The pilot stick was connected only to the trim tabs on the controls. So, on a huge boat like this, you can see the size of the rudder, for example. To move that rudder normally gives you an extremely heavy footload. If you were just moving the tab, it was quite light. But this meant, of course, that the controls, normally, when the aircraft was parked, so to speak, had to be riding free. And so they were lockable, and you had to unlock. And I had when I first went to fly it up in Trondheim, I had a bit of a deal with it, because I thought this is a big boat. My experience flying boats hadn't gone that high. So I asked to have a Luftwaffe captain fly with me, and he was in the left seat, I was in the right. His flight engineer was handling the throttles. My flight engineer was standing by. And on takeoff up the Trondheim Fjord, we went thundering along for about a mile and a half with no sign of unsticking at all. The noise was incredible, the bashing of water on the side. So I had my feet lightly on the rudder pedals. I just pressed them a bit, and I felt they could move all right. I thought, what about the elevator? So I gave a little tweak, solid. Now, what he had done was lock the elevators free to wreck the boat and try and kill us. But right to the end, there were trouble with Germans who were fighting their own war after the capitulation had finished the official war. And one always had to be it. I went armed to the teeth. I used to carry 9 9mm guns with me. anywhere I went in Germany, because you were always at risk, right up to about 1947, really. So things could be very different. And that, as I say, was my experience in this. Did we have the last one? No, you don't have another one. Right, now that gives me a quick opportunity to talk about some of the war criminals we dealt with. You remember I showed you the, where is the aircraft? Here it is, here. This aircraft, the Arado 234. Now, at the end of the war, Germany was divided into occupation zones. And British had the western part of Germany. The Russians had the northern part. The Americans had the southern part. Nobody cared much what the French had. There we are. And in Germany, a lot of the Americans came to me and said, look, in our entire zone we have a single Arado 234, and we have been told to bring 2 of each kind back. So I had found a window for 234s in Norway. We had about 30 there, so I gave them 2. And they came back a month later and said, the Secretary of State said, could we have another 2? Because we find this a particularly interesting thing. And I thought, chance of a deal here. And I said to this, my opposite number, the American, was doing what I was doing. I said, look, I will try and get you 2 more Arados if you try and get me an interview with Hermann Goering. And he said, that's difficult, but I'll try. And I said, well, mine is difficult too, and I'll try. And then at the end of the day, I gave him his 2, and he said he had fixed this interview, which occurred on the 17th of June in 1945. But at that time, Goering had been captured by the Americans and was held prisoner in a hotel in Luxembourg, about 12 miles south of Luxembourg City. And I was told I could have an hour with him, but I must not ask him any political questions because he was about to be tried at Nuremberg. But I could ask him any questions I liked on the aviation. Now, I spent an hour with him, so I'm not going to tell you all the questions. I'll tell you the main one, I thought. But anyway, when he came in, he was very different from the person we used to see pictures of, quite bulky gentleman. And, of course, when he was captured, they found he was a drug addict. And the Americans had weaned him off drugs by this time, and we looked, his rather thin, his uniform was hanging on him. Anyway, the interrogation room was tables, and he sat one side and I sat on the other, and up in the corner was an American officer who was making sure I stuck to the agreement, didn't ask him any political questions. Now, up to that time, Goering had only been interrogated by American lawyers of German extraction. And we could see when he came in, he was fed up to the teeth with interrogation. But this invigilating officer, as the American was called, said to him, now you are going to be interrogated by a British pilot. And the change in Gurney, he almost smiled, in fact, and was very polite, answered every question I asked him, and the main one I asked him, it took an hour, but the main one I asked him was, what, in your opinion, was the outcome of the Battle of Britain? And he said, a draw. Now, this is not as crazy as it sounds. And I said to him, would you explain to me how you arrived at that conclusion? He said, right. And if you do this, what he told me, you'll find it's true. He said, if you look at the analytical charts of the progress of the Battle of Britain, in the last week, things had changed, but in that the Germans came into the ascendancy in the sense of the number of aircraft and crews lost. They had been losing more than the Brits all the time until the last week. Now that is true. I've checked this. The other thing was, he said, we were not defeated, we withdrew because Hitler had called all fighter units back to Germany to prepare for Operation Barbarossa, which was the invasion of Russia. This is also true, and if Hitler had been able to go ahead with his plans at that time, I'll explain to you, there might have been a very different outcome. But he had to hold them up for a month and a half because of trouble in the Balkans. But even so, he went into the invasion late. I don't think many of us realize that the advance guard of the Germans were actually in the Kremlin when the first snows came. The problem was the logistic train was 200 miles back down the road, bogged down in snow, with no guns, no fuel, no food, no ammunition, etc. So they couldn't stay holed up in the Kremlin and had to leave. But it was as close as that. And one has to remember that it was a very dicey thing. So that incident in the Balkans, that hold-up, created that possibility for us. It was interesting, when we finished, Gary and I talking, he came forward to me and held out his hand. Now, there was no way I could shake his hand. So I thought, the devil am I going to do now? And I remembered, of course, he was himself a famous fighter pilot in World War I. He had been commander of the Richthofen Squadron and had won the Pour le Mérite, which is the equivalent of the British VC. And my father had been a World War I fighter pilot, and he had told me the German pilot greeting when they met each other. So I remember this, so I said to, when Gary held out his hand, I didn't do anything, but I said to him, Halsen Beinbruch. Now what that means is a fighter pilot to me, typical fighter pilot said, hope you break your neck and break your legs. And he smiled because he realized that once the position comes in, and he just lowered his hand gently and went. What did I finish? With Himmler and the guy? Himmler was the worst of all the Germans. look like it. And at the end of the war, Goering had fallen out with Hitler. And likewise, Himmler had fallen out with Hitler, because Himmler had approached the Swedes and tried behind the scenes to arrange a peace initiative with the Allies. And Hitler would have none of it, of course. And he banished Himmler, would have nothing more to do with it. But since Hitler was holed up in a bunker in Berlin, Himmler could range free. When Hitler committed suicide, he appointed Grand Admiral Dönitz as his successor. Dönitz took 2 brigades of SS troops, real top-notch fighters, and holed up in a castle near Flensburg. And surrounded by these 2 brigades of SS top troops, the British thought, now there's no point in fighting, there'll be huge casualties, we'll just starve them out. So they just surrounded it, starved them out. But Himmler arrived and asked Dönitz to take him, to give him a refuge in the castle. Dönitz disliked Himmler intensely and told him no way, he was on his own. So we knew he was roaming free somewhere in Germany. And it's difficult to imagine what it was like at the end of the war in Germany. In towns it was like walking on the moon with nothing but destruction, rocks and bricks everywhere. And out in the open, thousands of people, some in uniform, some in plain clothes. Nobody knew who anybody else was. So the only way of finding out was asked to see their identity papers. You could only look at a few of these. So we established outposts to do this. And one of them, which was manned by 3 Second Army privates, actually 2 were privates, and the other was a major. It was more than that, it was a lieutenant colonel actually, but dressed as privates. And 3 SS sergeants came along, they checked their papers, decided 2 were okay, but 1 was in doubt. And they held this guy, said I was on the way. Now these were just privates in the Second Army, and they weren't quite sure what to do next. But they went to the next higher stage of these outposts, which was manned by a warrant officer at a little village called Barnstedt. And the warrant officer spoke schoolboy German, but Himmler didn't speak any English, so they weren't getting very far. And Himmler kept calling himself Heinrich Hitzinger. But the warrant officer was so persistent that he got under Himmler's skin. And Himmler finally said to him, "No, I'm Heinrich Himmler." Unfortunately, the warrant officer said, "Oh yes, and I'm Julius Caesar." But having said that, he then had a second thought and said, "I better watch I don't make a huge mistake." So he called the headquarters, and I was at an airfield called Celle, which is quite near this village of Barnstedt. And I got a call from the headquarters saying, "Look, in peacetime you've seen Himmler at big parades, and we heard you say he walked in a peculiar manner. Would you come and identify this guy we have?" So I agreed. Now, they sent a car for me, and went there. And as soon as I walked in, I knew it was Himmler. He didn't really have to walk up and down, but we made him do so. And I said to the intelligence chaps, can I interrogate him? They said, no, you can't. I said, well, let me ask him 2 questions, just to prove his identity. Only he will know the answers. So I'll tell you one question here. The first question I said to him was, in early 1944, you imprisoned Wernher von Braun for 3 months. Here's your top genius engineer. Why did you do this? And he said, well, and he was totally right here. He said, because I was of the opinion he was not pursuing the war effort, he was pursuing his hobby. And he was 100% right. Anyway, we took this chap, Himmler, back to headquarters. And as he went through the door, came to the door, the doctor, Second Army doctor, came forward, made Himmler open his mouth, put 2 fingers in his mouth, and Himmler bit on his fingers, not in a nasty way. What he was doing was crushing the cyanide pill between his teeth. And in 10 seconds, he was dead. And just to give you the final bit, we told the Foreign Office what had happened. And they said, right, get a cardboard box, get 4 pallbearers, and a young captain to lead them. Tell them to zigzag through Lüneburg East, dead of night, bury him somewhere, zigzag all the way back, so no way will they remember where they buried him. And to this day, nobody has found Himmler's bones. Although if you go to Lüneburg East, every Sunday, you'll find dozens of Germans with their buttons in their digging for Himmler's bones. There we are, that's the story of a very evil country. Very small part of the story I was involved in at the end of the war. I hope you enjoyed it.